Hi, I'm John Finnegan, and I'm here with Professor Scott Nelson, who has written an incredibly amazing book called Oceans of Grain: How American Wheat Remade the World. It could not be more timely. The book begins in Odesa, and all of us this year have been captivated by what is transpiring in Ukraine and how it affects all of us throughout the world. So, with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Scott Nelson, who's joining us from Rome, Italy today, because Scott, you are teaching a class here in the month of June, correct?
That's right. I'm teaching a history of capitalism class at John Cabot University.
How did that come about? Why is it that you do that?
I teach at University of Georgia, and one of the specialties of University of Georgia is history of capitalism. And John Cabot approached us about doing a class, the birthplace of capitalism, Genoa and Venice in the 15th century. And so it made sense to have a class in Rome about that. And there are a bunch of study abroad students, and it's been fun to meet these students and talk to them about, how to think about economics and politics and history and all that stuff. So
that is fantastic. Earlier this year, a dear friend of mine who has a book club in Florida. He is a fellow Rotarian, and I've known him for many years. He introduced me to your book because they were reading it, and so I had been reading Stephen Kotkin's book on Stalin because we have a trip planned to Riga, Latvia, and following Latvia, we're heading to Sweden because we were originally headed to St. Petersburg, which did not seem appropriate.
Yes.
We made a change to our trip planning. And we picked Sweden, Scott, because one of our members is from Sweden. He happens to be there as we speak. He headed home on Wednesday. And I picked up your book again, and lo and behold, you make reference to your Swedish grandmother, Mimi. Why did you do that? What prompted you to do that?
My grandmother grew up in the 30s, which her Sweet 16 was just a few weeks before the Great Depression. And she talked to me about that depression. And she said, the 1930s was a rough time, but it was wasn't nearly as bad as the 1870s. And she herself had grown up with her grandparents. Her grandparents had raised her, and they had been kind of driven out of Sweden in the latter part of the 1870s. There were real poverty, and they arrived in the U.S. And so I'm talking to my grandmother, who says the depression that you think is important in the 1930s is nothing like the Great Depression of the 1870s. And it's sort of stuck with me. And she taught me a lot about how to darn a sock and how to prepare for the next downturn. She shaped my way of thinking about the world a lot.
Yeah, you and I met for the first time by phone, 3 weeks ago now, and we had so much in common. The other thing is that on that trip, I was talking about starting in Latvia, and your son had been there recently because he's learning Russian, getting a PhD in Russian history?
Yeah, Russian and American history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But Latvia was the perfect place for him to practice his Russian. Is that correct?
Right. An inexpensive place to like. It's difficult for researchers to get into Russia now. That even before the conflict over Ukraine, there's been a lot of tension between the U.S. and Russia, and so he was thinking about initially going to Ukraine, and then decided that Latvia was actually the best place. It's a place that's where a lot of people speak Russian, and it's relatively inexpensive, and there's great mountain climbing apparently there as well. So
there it is. We got a picture of it. So. Why did you have a desire in your undergraduate work to study German? And then when you were getting your PhD, I think it was, you were studying Russian. What It turned out to be very handy later.
It did, and particularly for America, you wouldn't normally think that an American historian would need either German or Russian, but initially, I think, it was really happenstance. I think that I was living in Florida, and the Spanish class was full. I wanted to learn a German language. I wanted to learn a foreign language, and German was attractive to me. It's all those syllables makes you sound very old when you speak it. 14-year-old Scott was very impressed by people who spoke German. So I think that was initially the konnten Sie mir sagen, wie wir nach Rodenbach kommen? That very. But for Russian, I just became more kind of fascinated by Russian history. Of course, I grew up in the Cold War, in the midst of the Cold War. So the history class that I had to take in Florida to graduate was Americanism versus communism, and so I learned about the Cold War that way. And the teacher who taught it gave us a much broader reading list than we were supposed to get. And so I read, I think, the Communist Manifesto. I read some Russian, and it's such a, coming from Florida, it was such a different world, and I was kind of fascinated by, that environment, I suppose. And and Russian was a challenge too. That was the other thing. It was exciting because it was, the Cyrillic alphabet, but a very different vocabulary and word order and things like that. So I like challenges. I was a math person initially, and I like setting myself up for sometimes I set myself up for failure, but I do like the challenges. And I think, but it was really happenstance that I ended up having the languages that I need, I think, for this project.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that because that is an important part of the story down the road. But before we leave that time period, you and I discovered we both worked for IBM once upon a time, and
Right.
You were on the technical side. You were hooking these giant computers together, and we used to jokingly say, because I was on the sales side, that the sales guys made the promises and you kept them.
Don't know about that. I think you also called us the White Sox boys, as I recall. But
and I don't know. Do your students know that you had a ponytail during that time? And
I don't think they did know that. I do tell them that I had a ponytail and a tie, and I had screwdrivers. I wore a suit. I wore a 2 or 3 piece suit, but I had screwdrivers in my pocket. So I definitely look the part of the sort of tech person. And when I was in Toronto, I mostly worked for companies like Deloitte and Touche and things like that, management consulting firms that they did accounting, but they also did management consulting. And I would often come in to fix problems in a big organization where someone had left and you needed the network running quickly. And so I did a lot of, forensics, trying looking through the desk, trying to figure out how this system was set up, where do the purchase orders go, where to, that was, it turned out for me, I think, a fascinating way of looking inside a bunch of very large companies and sort of understanding how they work.
You looked at business at a very granular level, and then you looked at it strategically as well.
Right. So I was working, one of the companies I worked for was called Dialex. It would own most of the clothing stores in Canada. And this was at a time when the biggest competition was the Gap and Walmart. This would be the 1992, 93, and the company was hemorrhaging stores. And one of the things that I had to do was identify places that identify costs and things like that for those things. Somebody else made the decisions about which stores to cut.
Yeah.
But I did logistics for those organizations, basically getting the network working, making sure that the malls networks were connected, and the cash registers and things like that. And I think understanding how those places worked was very important. Mostly what I did was a very, very specialized thing. I got different protocols working on the same network. So, IPX, SPX, TCP/IP, DECnet, all of those things. And so I ended up being in the corporate offices quite a bit, and so learned a lot about strategy, structure, and how large institutions worked, really.
Right. Yeah. So then you decided to go back to school. Your wife did as well, right? Or was she a graduate student at that time?
So it's funny. When I was a network engineer and managing these networks and fixing these networks, I was actually had done everything but finishing my PhD. And by the time I was doing that, I was, as you can imagine, making quite a bit more money than a professor would make, and enjoying the challenges. Just like German and Russian, it was challenging to see a network broken and then fix it and get the company going again, get all the wheels moving. Right. And I was actually just about to pitch the PhD. I had everything done but the dissertation, and then we had to make a move to Virginia and started teaching. And I think it was a great decision for me, but it wasn't quite how I imagined. I'd imagined carrying on with the ponytail and the tie for a little bit longer, but yeah, my wife was also a historian, and I followed her to Virginia. And when I arrived, they needed somebody to teach American history, and that was where I was. So.
Yeah, you really, the thing that I'd like to say is that this book grabs you because it starts in Odesa, and that's critically important. You tell the great story of that black, rich soil.
Yes.
And the importance of that, and that our history goes back 8,000 years before Christ, and that the transporting of this grain and those paths were so critically important to the building of empires.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I suppose it was inevitable that a network engineer was going to see the network there. But I think that it's also, I became interested in the sort of international economy, initially this financial panic. And then I came across this fellow Parvis, who was a communist and an economist, who had this sort of way of understanding the economy that was very different from anything I'd ever heard of before. It was he saw these networks as being the kind of foundation, the networks and food transportation networks as being the foundation of empires, and that for him, empires sat on top of these paths, that the paths were there first and the empires came later. It's only recently, back in 2018, 2019, that we've using next generation genome sequencing with DNA and teeth, that we've been able to identify that there were, in fact, these long distance trading networks that went from China, Manchuria, all the way to Sweden. And this is, 2800 BC. This is before there are any empires. And we know from the sequencing of the teeth that there are no people that traveled from China, from Manchuria to Sweden. But there was food, apparently, that was traveling because the plague travels along that network very quickly.
And also disease, microbes.
Microbes. And the thing about plague is it's inside the bellies of rats or the bellies of humans, but it can't travel far. So it needs some sort of continuous network of food. So before we have writing that's really for any of this period, any of this region, we have trade. And so it turns out that Parvis, I think, was right, that we're used to thinking about networks as the places that put these paths together, and then everybody else who's trading as a worker bee. And for Parvis, no, this trade takes place before all that happens. Trade may be the first profession before farming. And the seeds that are scattered underneath people's feet are the source of what we now call planting and sowing and those sorts of things. And thinking about that, you start to see, and that's what Parvis saw, the weaknesses of empires. And he was from Odesa. It was Jewish family. This was a period of pogroms and attacks on Jews by the Russian Orthodox Church and by Cossacks and things like that. And he saw the weakness of the Russian Empire. He saw that it depended fundamentally on those trading paths, and just tweaking them, just changing them a little bit could spell the end to empires. Now, that sounds like big words from someone, writing the 1880s and 1890s, but Parvis is the person who persuades the German government to send a sealed train of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to the Finland station to start the Russian Revolution. So he knows whereof he speaks, right? He's in a way the architect of the Soviet Union.
How did you first discover him?
I was going to do another project on the Panic of 1873, and I was interested in these four people that I was going to follow. I called them the four horsemen of the liberal apocalypse, four critics of economic liberalism. Anton Chekhov, Sigmund Freud, Rosa Luxemburg, and Dwight Moody, the evangelist. Right. And when I was reading Rosa Luxemburg's papers, all of them were teenagers at the time they were young people at the time of the Panic of 1873, and it shaped their way of thinking about the world. And when I was reading Rosa Luxemburg's papers, I saw that she said everything I learned about the mass strike and international capital, I learned from Parvis. I thought, who is this guy Parvis?
Yeah.
And that was a fateful discovery. I've been writing about grain and international networks and the American Civil War and things like that for a while. I thought the key to the Panic of 1873 was wheat. And turned out I was plagiarizing Parvis inadvertently, because he had said the same thing in 1880. And he'd said, you cannot understand this financial panic unless you understand wheat. It's an agrarian crisis, and it has everything to do with the United States.
So now your language skills came into play, because he wrote in Ukrainian, he wrote in Russian, and he wrote in German. And you were able to read the original sources to have a better understanding of what he was trying to convey, right?
Right. And a lot of his stuff was not published. So it was in newspapers and things like that. So it was a good bit of scrolling through microfilm reels and things like that. Some of them were in pamphlets, and I had to travel quite a bit, British Library and other places like that, to find those pamphlets and scan them. But yeah, I had the German and Russian, and I knew a little bit about the sort of Marxist language and stuff like that from my initial interest in German and Russian, when I was a teenager. And so, he became my man crush, I suppose. Yeah. He, a person who explained the economy. He was a Marxist who disagreed with Marx, and so that also intrigued me. That he was somebody who was kind of like himself a Marxist, but saw all these flaws in it, and but it turned out that he was one of these people like Forrest Gump, who was connected to everything. You can't, the Ottoman Empire is able to defend Gallipoli in World War One. The British try to take Gallipoli. We know that's a part of World War One. We don't know why it's important necessarily, but the reason is because Russian grain is needed to feed France and Great Britain. And Parvis is the person who mounts guns in Odesa, sells the guns that, mounts guns in Istanbul,
right,
and in Gallipoli, so that Turkey can defend itself against invasion from France and Great Britain. And so he's a really important player in World War One. He's an important player in the coming of the Russian Revolution, and he predicts all these things that end up, most of them, taking place. And so that's that part of him, both understanding his intellectual way of understanding the world, and then seeing now where those weaknesses are. He writes a 20-page story plan for how the Russian Revolution is going to unfold and why it's going to work. And
would you sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So,
Would you liken him to a Rupert Murdoch today? Would that be a good analogy or not so much?
yeah, something like that. Something like that. Somebody who um, has a kind of fundamental feeling for what is going on at a kind of deeper level. Like
Mhm.
he's definitely a contrarian, right? He's definitely someone who you know, marches to his own drummer. But as a business thinker, I mean, he becomes a multimillionaire as a grain trader.
Right.
That's how he makes his fortune. But he also believes that the Russian Empire is a brutal empire, and he wants to end it. He's not quite ready for the storm of blood that comes with the Bolshevik Revolution. He's not, but he, in a way, sets it going by recognizing really how weak the Russian Empire is.
He influences Trotsky, Lenin, and so many others. But the
Right.
reason why I brought up Rupert Murdoch is because all of those guys understood the importance of owning the publishing of information. So it all begins with
Oh,
information and ideas, and
I
then the
see.
dissemination of that information to influence
Yes.
others. That's
Yes,
what I would.
yes, yes. I see. Right. No, so I was thinking about the kind of business acumen, but you're talking about, yeah, understanding news and understanding why news is important. Yeah, so he was one of these people who was in what was called the newsroom of the Boers, which was the it's closest thing we have to this today would be the London Metal Exchange or the trading pit of the Chicago Board of Trade or something like that. The Boers was the place where grain was traded. And it was a newsroom. It collected newspapers from all over. And these people made their fortunes on the price of grain. And you knew what that went up when there were wars. You identified where the sources of grain were, and you identified who the customers were. And that's the pulse of the world. I think that's I think what he got from this is that they collected news, that they dealt with news, that they made decisions about grain, buying and selling grain, using this news, and they were ahead of Whitehall. They were ahead of these imperial leaders because they understood better what was going on because they needed that information. And he was actually, Parvis was actually trained as a student of news. That was part of the thing that he was interested in. And he became a little bit of a propagandist at the same time as he was still a kind of collector and winnower of news. Unfortunately, the person that's most like him is Hermann Goering, and Goering is becomes the kind of propagandist for the Nazis. Goering, when Parvis dies, Goering moves into his house,
Right.
and I'm sorry,
Goebbels.
yeah, Goebbels. I said Goering. It's late in the day. Sorry. There's Goebbels, who the propagandist for the Nazis, who moves into his house and tries to be the kind of mover and shaker that
Right.
Parvis was. Nobody knows about Parvis in the 21st century, but for Goebbels, that was somebody who understood the world and could explain it well. And in that sense, yeah, Rupert Murdoch is seeing the news as being both a source of information and a kind of way of disseminating your story is what Parvis understood well.
So Parvis was born in Russia, lived a certain period of time in Istanbul, and then died in Berlin, right? Which was the house that Goebbels then acquired.
Yeah.
Is that right? So did he live most of his life in Germany or in Turkey?
No, he was, let's see. So he's born in Belarus in 1967, which is part of Russia at the time, or Russian Empire. And he travels down to Odessa when he's about 7 or 8, and he leaves when he's 18 or 19, and then he never comes back. So he's in Germany, traveling all over Germany for a while. But because he's a communist, he's chased every German town once they discover who he is. He sets up a newspaper, and then the Okhrana, which is the Russian secret police, notify the people in the town. And so he has to leave. And in fact, that's how Rosa Luxemburg gets her first editorship, is that he has to leave very suddenly from Berlin, and she takes over his paper, which is very popular. So he spent most of his time in Germany, and he loved Russia, but he couldn't go back, because if he did go back, he would be likely killed by the Okhrana for being a communist, or being a social democrat. And he doesn't go to Istanbul until around 1910. And it's because, and again, this is his predictive power, he knows that World War I is going to start there. And he goes down to Istanbul and quickly becomes close to the Young Turks. And he watches the way they build a new kind of state in Istanbul. And he writes a kind of history of the Ottoman Empire. That's first that I could not read. That was in Turkish. That was a bridge too far. Luckily, and that was when Turkish was used the Arabic script too. So somebody did rewrite it in the 1980s in Turkish, the English Turkish script that we're used to, or the Roman Turkish script that we're used to. But even still, I had to rely on a lot of Googling to get through that book, because I don't have Turkish. But yeah, he can become. Ordinarily, people who are grain traders aren't very political, as you can imagine, right? They make their money from the rise and fall in prices. But Parvis had reasons to sort of mix his economics and his politics, and he becomes a very, very important, very, very powerful person, and somebody who the Bolsheviks hate to recognize, right? Because he's the person who's sort of the man behind the curtain. And the fact that he's Jewish is important too, ultimately later, because the Russians kind of create this anti-Semitic picture of the communist Jew who's behind the Bolsheviks. So it's both in Russia and in Turkey, the picture of Parvis is tinged with anti-Semitism, I think.
I am deeply disappointed to not be able to go to St. Petersburg, where I've never been.
Yes.
And and so you inspired that desire because of your writing about Catherine the second, aka Catherine the Great, and who was influenced by the writers of the Enlightenment. She got economics, and she knew that if she acquired that Ukraine and that black soil and the deep water port of Odessa, that would be such a great asset for the Russian Empire. So,
So she's a physiocrat. She's those are the people who believe, physio is a bunch of things, but it means basically nature, and krat means leader, or rule by nature. And the physiocrats believed that the natural world was the source of wealth, and particularly the grain production. And so the physiocrats were French economists who believed that you should take away as many barriers as you can from a farmer, because the farmer produces wealth that feeds the nation. But among the things that they should do is sell grain to other places. And that's very different from how empires worked in the past.
Right.
In the past, you had an outer ring where the grain was produced, like the Roman Empire, like the Qing Empire. The grain is produced in this outer ring. It moves into the city or the capital, where you have leather and pottery and things like that, and out to feed the armies. And the physiocrats believed, no, you should remove all the limitations from a farmer as possible, not tax the farmer, but tax everyone else, and then trade your grain internationally. Any excess grain should be sold for foreign exchange. And the timing is perfect because first the French Revolution happens, and then Napoleon's invasion of Europe. Everybody needs grain, and so when she invades the Black Sea region, builds Odessa after she dies, it becomes basically the thing that pays for Russia's advance and expansion. I think if Catherine the Great had lived after the 1790s, that she would have moved the capital of Russia to Odessa. I think,
Wow.
just like Peter the Great moved the capital to Petrograd, Petersburg.
Right.
So I think it makes a lot more sense. I mean, her long-term goal was to take Istanbul,
Right.
but Odessa was really the source of Russia's wealth.
She was an amazing leader. Yeah.
Yeah, and really kind of, I mean, a peculiar in so many ways because highly literate, ready to kind of borrow principles from Germany, from France, from these other places, committed to learning. The nice thing about the physiocrats for our purposes is they are committed to universities, they are committed to teaching, and they are committed to make things easier for farmers. The other people who are the most physiocratic in the world were, of course, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, also very strongly influenced by the physiocrats, also believed that farming was the way in which a new kind of state, a new kind of empire could be created.
Yeah. We think of globalization as being a 20th century phenomenon, but it really was a 19th century phenomenon. You taught me, and maybe it's earlier, but from your book, that is your area of expertise, and that's what I got from
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're still not at the level of international trade in food that we were, per capita, that we were in the 1860s and 1870s. We have more food that we trade internationally, but there were 2 bushels of wheat for every person west of the Rhine that was being transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1860s, and that's in terms of population. I mean, the population has increased, but that in relation to population is quite high. We've moved back from that level of international interdependence on food, of course, in World War I and in World War II. We're only now, in a way, getting back to that kind of global food world again.
And another change for me in thinking was thinking about grain or food in general as being stored energy, because as a society, we're so obsessed by oil. Now we've got President Biden going hat in hand to Saudi Arabia. There's all kinds of moral implications around that, and that was a powerful concept for me to understand.
Right. Vaclav Smil is probably the person that I most learned from, who's a chemist and a historian. And he says, we need to, particularly in the earlier period, we need to understand that grain is for horses, grain is for people, grain is a source of energy. We measure it in calories. We measure our food in calories, just like we measure our steam engines in calories in terms of their efficiency. And that's the engineer in me, right? It's constantly trying to find the source of those things, and water, right? Water is the big. It's the most frictionless surface that we have to deal with. 90% of international trade now is by container, because water is an excellent way to deliver it. We have lots of trains, we have lots of cars, we have lots of trucks, but a lot of our trade is still on water because there's so much less friction on it. And so the advantage of Odessa is it's right up against the water, flat plains, beautiful fresh water, and a deep port that allows you to sell grain to the rest of the world. One of the things that I try to do is to point out that the United States tries to emulate Russia during the Civil War. It tries to make Chicago into the Odessa of America, because there's, there are Great Lakes that connect Chicago via canal all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and during the Civil War, the Union Army tries very hard to make Chicago into something like Odessa. And again, it's where the grain is, where the water is, and where the flat plains are.
When I read your book, I read it through the lens of business. And so your discussion around futures contracts are, I think, so critical that, is it in 1860 that in Chicago, it is our federal government, the North in particular, needing, it goes back to our friend Jack Buffington, the professor at DU that I had mentioned to you, that logistics is so important, but it begins with this need to acquire things in the future and to protect prices and all of the things that go with that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in some sense, a forward contract, a contract where something is going to be delivered 90 or 180 days from now, and there's a slip of paper that represents that, and it travels and is exchanged by traders. That goes all the way back to Venice and the 14th century. Some parts of it go all the way back to the Ottoman Empire. But a futures contract is a small amount of grain. It's 1,000 bushels or 100 bushels or 500 bushels, not a kind of contract for whatever grain is being shipped. And the thing that's important about a futures contract, I discovered as I was working through the records of the War Department, is that it made the buyer invisible. And so usually in a bill of exchange and in a forward contract in the 14th through the 19th century, there was a bill of exchange. The person who was receiving it was named in the bill. The person who was sending it was named in the bill, and then of course other people could countersign it for that. But a bill of exchange is a fixed amount. It's not the amount of grain you need, but you stack them up. So if you need 10,000 bushels of grain, you get 100,000 bushel contracts, and the person who finally buys it is anonymous, and the Chicago Board of Trade ensures that it will be delivered. So if the person who's promised to deliver this grain doesn't fulfill their end of the obligation, then the Chicago Board of Trade makes it good. And that's very important because previously with those bills of exchange, you were looking at who's providing this grain. Who's backing this up? What's the name of the bank that's here? And so it's a fungible contract that you can buy and sell, but it's one which there are a lot of risks involved in that contract. Here, the risks are kind of subtracted from it and becomes a very abstract thing. 1,000 bushels of grain, 100 bushels of grain, and it allows the Union Army, which already has grades of grain, to get initially oats. To feed horses in the Union Army. There's 1 million horses. That's back to energy again, right? The Union Army has all of these horses that it needs to feed. Chattanooga has been surrounded in 1864. The grain traders figure this out, the oat traders, and they raise the prices. And so the Union Army figures out a way of buying futures contracts as a way of getting around those, a dozen or so oats traders and creating a kind of public market. And, as somebody who, started out as a kind of Marxist, as a, 18 or 19-year-old, I've come to really understand and appreciate how important markets are. And we see this now, right? We see grain prices going up because of the blockade of Ukraine. And because that price is sending a message to farmers to shift from corn to wheat or to plant extra fields and things like that. And that's going to save us. I mean, I think we're going to see serious hunger problems this summer because of the grain that's missing, and it's that market that we need. And so we're used to thinking about markets as being something that comes out of the minds of entrepreneurs, but in this case, it's the Union Army that's in trouble, that sets
Right.
it up.
But today we've got a very different issue, and that is that, you know, the name that I didn't mention earlier is this dear friend of mine by the name of Bill Korstead. And Bill and I are fellow Rotarians. Rotary
Uh-huh.
is a service organization with 35,000 plus clubs around the world and 1.2 million members. And we care about, what's happening to people with respect to food, in particular, water, as as well as an important part of Rotary's work.
Right.
And I was talking about our discussion to Bill this morning, and he brought up the point that, I guess the children and the individuals who are not going to have this food, that there are long-term implications that don't get discussed today. Yes, we're worried about nuclear war with
Yes.
Russia,
Right.
but
That's right.
there will be kids whose growth will be stunted
That's right.
because they don't have adequate calories and nutrition. And, because a lot of this grain going to places like Egypt and Africa isn't going to happen. And real decisions need to be made.
Right.
Should we protect those ships at
Right.
the risk of expanding the war to get
Yes.
that grain out to keep those
Yes.
people alive?
Right.
I know you've
20
got
million.
lots of.
Yeah, no, 20 million metric tons is the estimate of what's sitting there, and it's not easily made up. It's yeah, the problem is, and you can see it. You can see the effect of shortages of grain in the census, right? And so you can see as this grain starts to flow initially from Russia and then from the United States into Europe, we see heights start to go up for soldiers 30 and 40 years later, because an individual's height doesn't really tell you much, but 10,000 individuals who are entering the army, if their height goes up 1 or 2 inches, what that says is, that they've gotten better food, and that's really important. And it's not as brutal and shocking as somebody dying of hunger, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about children who are underfed, who are going to be stunted in one way or another by that lack. And that's also something that people get very upset about, as you can imagine, right? People care maybe more than anything else about the future of their kids. And when prices shoot up a lot, then we also see political protest. I mean, that's the French Revolution, that's the Russian Revolution, but it's also Arab Spring. Wheat prices went up 40% when there was drought and wildfires in Russia, and Arab Spring was the result. People were very angry about this, and Syria collapses, and it produces a refugee situation that we're still, watching the wake of. I worry too about future conflicts. In the 18th and 19th century, when people got angry and upset, there might be change, or there might be revolution. Or now in the 21st century, when people get upset and they protest in a place like Egypt or in a place like Syria, where people, the governments have tanks and they have tear gas, and they're much more powerful than citizens. And so I worry about a kind of cascade of violent effects from this shortage of food.
There are no easy answers, but clearly that if we as individuals have more information, we're going to make better decisions in all aspects of our life.
Right. Right.
And that we have to care about someone on the other side of the planet. Yes, the aggregate cost of our groceries is more expensive today. And for many of us, it's an inconvenience. For some of us, maybe most of us, it can be the difference between buying medicine or buying food. And those are critical decisions. But in developed countries, you die.
You're right, right. Yeah, in underdeveloped countries, it's a serious problem. And so we spend in the United States something like 18 to 20% of our household income on food. So that's we're in the EU. It's depending on the country, it's anywhere from 24 to 30%. In Ethiopia and in Egypt and in Nigeria and places like that, it's 45%, 45%, which is very high percent of household income that just goes for food. And a lot of that is grain.
Yeah.
A lot of that is bread that comes, that's provided by the government, subsidized by the government. And, if the grain's not there, then the food prices are going to go up, and people are going to go hungry, and that's a problem. That's a serious problem. The other thing is that you can't just change. Somebody had suggested, well, what about rice, or what about other foods? And it's these are people that are kind of weed-eating people in what's used to be the old Byzantine Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire. From the Straits of Gibraltar to the Strait of Hormuz was the reach of the old Byzantine Empire, and it became the reach of the Ottoman Empire. Those people have been eating bread or naan or wheat, basically, in one form or another, for 2,000 years. You can't just simply change to
Right.
some other crop or food, and then of course getting it to these really remote places is important. The friction to get things to a place like Southeast Nigeria is quite high, and back to the Black Paths, getting food there is expensive, and you can't just trade one food for another.
I also want to be respectful of your time, because it's getting late where you're at, and but what questions did I not ask you today? Do you think that I might have?
Yeah.
What?
I think part of what we maybe the thing that's changed my way of thinking about the economy maybe is we think about the physiocrats, and we think about these other ways of thinking about the economy as being just old and wrong theories, right? Old and demolished ways of thinking about the economy. But I think if we kind of put Parvis goggles on from time to time and start to see how it is that food moves around the world, we can see kind of what a crisis we're in right now in Ukraine. I hate to say that it's a crisis that has ramifications all around the world, in part because of those Black Paths, because of those routes by which food takes. The other thing I think that I learned as I was working on this Black Paths things was something from the World Food Program and the UN, which is that if you look at the price per ton mile to move goods along roads in a country, and you take that price and you multiply it by 650, you get the GDP of that country. It's a 0.9 correlation. I mean, scientists love a 0.9 correlation. That's a very, very close correlation between GDP and the sort of cost per ton mile to deliver something in a region. So places that have very high costs also have lower GDP. Places that have lower costs have higher GDP. And partly that's a reinforcing thing, right? You have more and more factories, more and more demand to produce good roads and railroads and things like that. But it's also, if you think back to energy and think about food networks as being a kind of circulatory system for a whole economy, we use the term economy as if we understand what we're talking about, but it's just a kind of thing that we throw over GNP and GDP. If we think about it as a kind of network, and we think about how much it costs to get something from one place to another, and then improving that somehow, that actually becomes very important if we're talking about economic development. Maybe more important than a lot of other things that seem, to be at the top of the list. If you want to improve an economy that's in trouble, that that improving that, shortening the cost, cheapening the cost to deliver things is the crucial thing. China learned that by building, massive railway in the last 25 years, has spent a tremendous amount building infrastructure to move things rapidly from one place to another, putting them closer into the international economy. The Belt and Road Initiative that China is involved in is in a way etching those black paths. So, as somebody who thinks about logistics and infrastructure, I think it's not just developmental economists that should be thinking about how it is that we get something from one place to another. It should be all of us who are thinking about business and thinking about, what we could do to make this world better for other people.
What would be fun in the future, if you're open to it, is maybe a panel of other individuals, Jack Buffington being one, Richard Lackey, chairman of the World Food Bank, and others. You and I can maybe engage in conversation and put together a panel that might be fun for others to listen to. And I'd be happy to work with you on that if that's appealing.
That sounds great.
Yeah, certainly getting you to Denver is top on my priority list, Scott. One of these days it's gonna fit. I know this fall you've got a class on Thursdays.
Right. Yeah.
So I haven't forgotten that. So
right.
We'll work on that together.
That sounds great. What I'd love to do is actually hash out these ideas with other folks. The thing about writing a book is it's a very solitary enterprise, and you share your project with people who know something about this or that. So I shared it with my Russianist friends. I shared it with my French historian friends. I shared it with my German historian friends. But those are all historians, right? And so actually to bounce some of these ideas off people who are practicing economics, practicing logistics. I've learned a lot actually from people just since the book came out, unfortunately 2 days before Putin's invasion, and so it became very timely. But hearing other people being interviewed alongside me, I've learned a lot that didn't end up in the book about how it is that we kind of think about and imagine our economy, and how it is that we can improve things for the rest of the world. That's it's made me a little bit, despite all of the horror that we're seeing lately, a little bit more hopeful about the alternatives.
You really helped me in another way, and that is over the last 5 years, I've become a different kind of a student. And so the fact that I could read your book and then watch you on YouTube in different, like in front of your class. So I think about a history class that I took as an undergraduate in college, and there was a guy up on stage, and I was in awe at all that he could remember, but he was inaccessible. And this is, we always talk about the bad things about this pandemic, but one of the good things was you were connected to your students in a very different way today. And I love the fact that they felt comfortable enough with you that they would be firing jokes at you, making fun of an image that you brought up. You would just roar in laughter. And so in addition to being a storyteller, you were accessible. You were accessible to your students. And, I'm your oldest student out here because of that. And so, I just want to emphasize that to maybe stimulate others to think about learning, because boy, we need an educated electorate in this country and beyond.
That's right.
And you're the one stimulating our thinking.
I have to say that COVID changed everything I did. And one of it was just getting constant feedback from the students was one of the things that I always wanted in a class of 300. And it's hard to do. No one wants to raise their hand. Right. But typing something on your phone is very easy for them. And I really loved that they had all these great questions and observations and would make fun of me and make fun of my images and stuff like that. It was a joy to teach in that way.
I could tell. Yeah. And so, if we can build upon that and improve it, and so I would encourage you to post more of those, because
Okay.
because it just promotes the great work that you're doing. It promotes the university and the great work that's being done, and it's a window into our young people today in
Right.
a way. So,
Well, thanks. I feel like the production values are pretty thin, and so I haven't told anybody about this. I just the students know about the YouTube channel. It's on the syllabus, but and I when I taught the class on Twitch, I would occasionally have people who just showed up and asked a bunch of questions. But in terms of my production, I'm not thrilled with the quality of the production there, but the lectures I stand by. I love telling stories to the students and making it important, and and this is civics. They need to understand what Federalist 10 is. They need to understand why there's a Constitution. They need to understand what the problems of the Articles of Confederation were, and what the Revolution was about. So I love that. I love that part of teaching.
With that, Scott Nelson, thank you so much for your time today. What time is it in Rome right now?
It's 8:56. It looks like you have one question, Anthony, from Anthony.
Let's see.
What is grain transport? Yes. It's what does your grain transport model say re U.S. economic strategy? So there's never been, the U.S. has never really had a kind of industrial policy wing. Like that was kind of verboten in part because of this emphasis on in the Constitution about not shaping or supporting particular kinds of industry. But I do think that grain transport is. Yeah, it's one of those things that we when we tend to talk about transport, we talk a lot more about moving people around. But I do think moving food around is important. There's been, I don't want to get too wonky, but the Inland Waterways Act, I think was really important and really understudied. We can't understand the U.S. ability to export grain without understanding how crucial the Inland Waterways Act was in making it possible to put waterborne transportation through many of the states that previously didn't have it, connecting the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, stuff like that. We don't talk about it, but if you look on the Mississippi River, you look on the Ohio River, there's lots of grain and other things moving there, and we need to. I'm a little bit puzzled why no one likes to talk about. Maybe that's me. I like to visit grain ports and sort of reconstruct how it is that the world is put together, but. I do think that inland waterways are maybe more important than rail in the U.S. in terms of strengthening our internal ability to move goods from place to place.
Yeah. You need to know what a real gift you are to all of us now. And I just strongly encourage you to keep writing. You've got a much broader audience, and I think it will just continue to grow. What are some of the other books we should know about?
Oh gosh, let's see. There's a book called
on John Henry.
Oh, my books. Oh!
Yeah.
I thought you meant much by other people. Oh.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book called Steel Driving Man about the legend of John Henry, and I figured out who the real John Henry was quite by accident. And that's a story about Reconstruction, but it's also a story about a man with a hammer who changes the future of the United States. That rewrites the history of the United States in part by finishing a tunnel that connects the East and the West. It's also about music. It's also about how it is that, in a kind of African-American culture, you can take something so horrible, a man who dies in prison alongside 200 other convicts, and turn it into something so beautiful. That's kind of my appreciation for the story of John Henry. I wrote a book called Nation of Deadbeats, which is a history of all the financial panics that the U.S. is involved in. And it's mostly about commodities. It's not about I talk about infrastructure and the first and second banks of the United States, but it's a somewhat breezy kind of fun history that plugs that tries to tell the story about commodities rather than people or not famous people like Alexander Hamilton and things like that, but why it is that changes in commodity prices have these effects. And with Carol Sheriff, I wrote a People at War, which is a history about regular people in the American Civil War. What else? Anyways, I started with railroads and I've moved out to kind of understanding commodities and economy and trying to tell it in a way that's interesting and engaging. And that's sometimes hard when you're talking about wheat. It's sometimes hard to get people excited about wheat, but this seems to have done so. The book is going to be, I mentioned this was going to be translated into simplified Chinese, complex Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, and now Russian. We just heard that a Russian publisher is going to publish it for both Russian and Ukrainian readers. So I never thought that would happen. I never thought that a kind of world history of grain would have that leverage, but part of it is what's going on now, and part of it is it's a fun read. I'll say that it's I take complicated arguments, complicated stories, and try to make them simpler and as approachable as possible.
It's very much needed today. So continue doing it, please. And we will look forward to that. I need to read this book a second time. It's that accessible. So.
Your questions are great. They're fantastic. So, well, thank you so much, John.
Okay.
All right. It's good talking to you.
Nice talking with you. See you again soon.
Okay. See ya.